Hello, everyone. Today I'm going to talk about some of my research. The title of the presentation is Looking Back and Moving Forward, the Importance of History for Economic Development. So I'm going to start with a question, which is why bother with history when we're studying economics, and in particular, economic development. So there's a number of natural answers to this, and I think many are obvious, that history is useful for understanding current economic phenomena for a number of reasons. So it provides more data, there's more variation to analyze, so why would we ignore the past when it's useful to study? The other thing, though, is that historical experiences of rich countries are informative for the potential experience of developing countries. So in other words, the time series of wealthy countries is informative to some extent of the cross-section of all countries in the world today. The other thing is that history provides us an ability to look at medium and long-run impacts, the dynamic effects, not just the short-run effects of policies, interventions, natural disasters, or whatever other phenomena we want to look at. So that's another important consequence or reason to study history. The other thing is that it provides natural experiments and instruments. That's particularly important for things that we can't randomize. So if we think about variation in institutions, for example, these are things that history naturally provides. And so these, I think, are standard reasons, but in this talk I want to argue more, actually, that history is not only useful because it provides these helpful characteristics about that I list, but it's actually necessary for understanding economic development. So in other words, if we don't take into account history, then at best our understanding is incomplete, right? And so this is what I'm going to talk about today. So just to motivate this, think about the global distribution of world income. This is it here. The richest 20% of countries are about 40 times richer than the poorest 20%, right? And even if you take the richest country and the poorest country, the difference is about a magnitude of 200, okay? So these are vast income differences, and this is the state of the world today. But if we look or just ask, well, where do these differences come from? Look further back in time, well, we can see that we haven't always had this level of inequality. And this is a measure of our best estimate of average per capita GDP for different regions of the world going back in time. Okay, so it's a little hard to see, but you can see that there's been clear divergence after 1700. This is well known. If we plot these same data on a log scale, we're able to see differences, and we see historically there are differences, but they're nowhere near the magnitude of the differences that we see today. Okay, so the best proximate answer of where did the differences in per capita GDP that exist today come from? Well, they came from the recent past, 1900, then 1800, then 1700. Really, the divergence is after the Industrial Revolution, which is about the 18th century. Okay. So history is important in a very obvious way, just from that fact, okay? So that might be obvious or not surprising that the best predictor of the world today is the world yesterday or even a century ago. There's a lot of evidence now that's been accumulated that there's significant persistence over long periods of time. So events in the distant past still have effects that matter today. And even there's persistence of per capita income, living standards across societies, particularly when you trace this at the society level and not the location level. Okay. But I think it's important and helpful to stop and pause and say why. It's not clear that we should have this this persistence and that there should be this level of persistence. Okay, and the answer that I've come up with is, well, in general, change is gradual and incremental. Okay, again, this is not mind-blowing that this makes sense, but I think it's helpful to think about this more deeply. Okay, so change in general occurs one step at a time in a piecemeal fashion, just like history occurs one step at a time in a piecemeal fashion. And I think if we stop and think about this, this is true for, I would say, many, if not all, of the fundamental determinants of economic development. Human capital, right? You increase your human capital one step at a time, right? Social capital, build connections one connection at a time. Cultural traits, institutions, policies, governance, even infrastructure, okay? And in many settings, the next step is only taken if it improves the situation at that point in time. So that's not always the case. We can think of some things like education, for example. We may obtain another year of education, even in at that point in time, it's not helping us, but maybe sometime in the future. But I think for a lot of things, that is the case, right? So that change happens incrementally and in a piecemeal fashion. And the change only occurs if that change at that point in time improves things. So you can think of legislation, you can think about whether that's the case in that instance, or institutional innovations, or improvement, changes in cultural traits, okay, cultural adaptation. So if we agree with that and we think, okay, what I just described characterizes history and historical change, then there's an analogy or an equivalence with evolution, right? And so that, what I just described, are the characteristics of biological evolution. And so just to illustrate this, I just want to give an example from a very well-known book by Richard Dawkins called Climbing Mount Improbable. And here he talks about eyes. So the eyes have independently evolved or emerged in at least 40 times across different animal species. And there's two primary types of eyes, compound eyes and camera eyes. And this has to do with the arrangement of lenses versus the photoreceptors. And so camera eyes are what humans have and many mammals. Compound eyes are the eyes that many insects have. And you can see even within these two broad categories, there's many different types of eyes that have evolved, okay? And this is from his publication. And the point here is that with evolution, and the analogy he uses is you're climbing up the mountain. So each incremental innovation has to move you uphill. Okay, so there has to be an improvement. And over time, there'll be incremental innovations. You'll move uphill until you reach a peak, right? So depending on your starting point, you may reach different peaks. And these are different types of eyes that have evolved. And some eyes are better than others. So you'll reach a local maximum, but it might not be a global maximum, okay? And the important point here is you can only move uphill, okay? So it's a question about, do we think of history, the evolution of human societies similarly, okay? So why might things be incremental and slow moving? Okay, and so I think that's really important if we think that, okay, this way of viewing history is helpful. So I think in a recent paper with Paolo Giuliano, we lay out and test some of this logic. And so the starting point here is that the real world is complicated and information is imperfect. And so it's costly and difficult. It takes effort, requires cost to acquire information, okay? So in this setting, and we talk about this in the paper, an effective strategy is to place value on the status quo, to place some value in tradition, for example, and to place some value in the way things have always been done in your society, in your religion, or in your family. And maybe you'll tinker, right, or experiment on the margins. There might be some slight incremental experimentation, and maybe you'll improve upon things, but you'll adhere to a large extent to the traditions of your society or your family, okay? And one reason why this might be beneficial is, well, the local optimization problem, how do we improve things from this point of where we're at, might be solvable. That might be doable, right? Whereas the global optimization problem, if we're going to start from scratch and redesign a whole society, is not, okay? And even if both were possible, right, local optimization is still likely better because it's going to save on information acquisition and processing costs, Okay, so you imagine if each new generation just completely re-optimized, there's going to be a lot of reinventing the wheel, a lot of information acquisition, bearing of costs that are redundant. Okay, so if instead you exploit the fact that the traits that have evolved up until this point must be pretty good because they've survived evolutionary forces and they're a result of past optimizations, then you can actually free ride on a lot of the information and optimizations which have been done by previous generations. Okay, so we talk about this again in more detail in this forthcoming review of economic studies paper, but that's the basic logic, and we outline a model that illustrates this logic and then test the model empirically. And it seems like, you know, according to the data, that this logic is valid. Okay. And then it's also worth asking, well, what type of optimization do we tend to see in the real world? Why is this? So if we think of institutional improvements, legislation, for example, we don't seem to be able to optimize globally, right? We can improve things in a piecemeal fashion, but we have to take as given the existing institutional environment, cultural environment, economic environment, and then optimize more locally. Okay. Okay, so one consequence of this, and this is just borrowing, you know, these notions and this way of thinking about history has been much more well developed within when thinking about biological evolution. Okay, so this is borrowed from biology, and this is the idea of evolutionary mismatch. Okay, and so this is because different traits are moving slowly, right, and in a piecemeal fashion. What you can have is that the environment doesn't match those traits. Okay, and so just to give you an example from biology, the kind of most well-known example is the example of baby sea turtles. So these baby sea turtles, eggs are laid on the beach, right, by the mother. The mother leaves the baby sea turtles hatch, and then they need to find their way back to the ocean. Okay, so they've developed a heuristic, biological heuristic, where they are attracted to bright light. Okay, and so what happens is the moon is shining, it reflects off the ocean, the sea turtles are attracted to that, so they head towards the ocean. Okay, so it's this heuristic which has developed over many generations. It works well. So, you know, it's great. And this is until the environment changes. So in many modern locations, there are urban environments which are built next to these beaches. So there are other bright lights besides the moon, right? So street lights, car lights, house lights of apartments, and the sea turtles will head towards those. So instead of heading towards the ocean, they'll head towards the freeway because there's lights or a city on the other side of the freeway. So you can see how this heuristic that's evolved is not optimized for the current environment. It was optimized for the past environment. So that's, you know, so that's basically one downside of slow incremental change. Okay, it's efficient, it's great, but you can get these settings where you have mismatch. Okay, so if we think of history as evolving similarly, or in particular, cultural traits is something I've looked at a fair amount, evolving similarly through an incremental piecemeal fashion and through evolutionary forces, they're kind of optimized over time, then there might be the possibility that there is mismatch. Okay, and so one setting that I've looked at, which I think it's very possible this is a setting of mismatch, is with Leonard Wanchicon. We have a paper that looks at the slave trade within Africa and the detrimental effect that had on trust of others within Africa. Okay, and so you can see here from this table, which is, these are data from Sigismund Kelle, who is a linguist who interviewed a number of individuals that were freed slaves that were brought to Freetown, Sierra Leone, 144 in total. He was interested in their what languages they spoke and documenting this, but he also asked each of the individuals, by the way, how did you get here? how did you become a slave? How were you enslaved? Okay, and so these are the responses. And one thing that's striking here is 20% said they were sold or tricked by a relative or a friend. So this was somebody close to them that they really trusted, turned on them, and had them sold into slavery, right? Had cooperated with slave raiders or slave traders and tricked them into slavery. There's others like kidnapped or seized through the judicial process, which also may have been very similar and very, very localized. So you can see this environment of the slave trade, which lasted upwards of 400 years. In this environment, a cultural trait of distrust may have evolved because it was relatively beneficial and well suited for that environment, okay? And in the paper, we show using cross-ethnicity variation. So in the number of individuals that were taken from each ethnic group, linking that to Afrobarometer data, we show that individuals whose ancestors were more heavily enslaved today exhibit lower trust in others, including family members, friends, co-ethnics, non-co-ethnics, okay? So it's a question about whether that low level of trust that exists today in those environments, in those societies, whether that's an example of mismatch, right? Those levels of trust might be lower than is optimal given the current environment, the current economic environment, business environment. There may be opportunities that are missed out upon because of that, okay? So another example from research I've done, this is with Alberto Alazina and Paola Giuliano. In this research, we look at a cultural trait, which is beliefs about gender equality. So should women have the same access to jobs, education, political power, managerial positions as men? And we trace differences in these beliefs around the world, which are vast. There are vast differences. If you ask that question in certain countries, 97% of people say yes. In other countries, 2% will say yes, okay? To traditional agricultural practices. So that's what we trace those vast differences to. And in particular, whether a society traditionally used plow agriculture. So this is a photo from South Korea in the 1950s. And you can see a plow here, which is being pulled by an animal. The plow overturns the soil, creates furrows, and seeds can be broadcast in those furrows. A benefit of the plow is it kills the weeds as well, okay? And so this is one agricultural implement, one form of agriculture. And one characteristic of this is that it requires a fair amount of upper body strength, right? To force the plow to continuously go through the soil, to also control the animal that's pulling the plow. Okay. The other type of agriculture is often called slash and burn agriculture, swidden agriculture, where a hoe or a digging stick is the primary implement. So smaller amounts of earth are moved in this case relative to this case. And it requires less upper body strength, okay? And so what we see historically is societies that had plow agriculture, men tended to specialize in work outside the home in the fields, and women tended to specialize in work inside the home. In societies that used hoe agriculture, there was about an equal division of labor. Women worked inside and outside of the home, and outside the home as much as men. Okay, so this generated a historical gender division of labor, which generated historical norms, values, and beliefs about the appropriate role of men and women in society. And so those traditional values and beliefs may have been pretty well suited, so have evolved to suit that historical environment. But what we find is those values and beliefs persist even today after societies move out of agriculture, that those same values and beliefs exist, and they affect things like female employment in the modern economy, female participation in managerial activities and firm ownership and in politics, right? And so again, this is a plausible example of mismatch, right? Those gender beliefs may not have been that harmful in the past because of the underlying agricultural technologies, but today, given our modern environment, they are particularly harmful, right? And there are some countries like Saudi Arabia have very, very low rates of female labor force participation, and there are beliefs and norms that underpin this. And so this may be an example of mismatch, right? Which has its roots in the fact that cultural change is slow and incremental. Okay, so those two are kind of more on the negative side, or so let me give you an example that's slightly more positive. This example comes from Joseph Henrich and co-authors, and they studied 15 small-scale societies around the world, and they played the ultimatum game in those societies. So the ultimatum game is there's two players. First player is given an amount of money, or told that there's an amount of money, that this amount of money has to be split between player one and player two. Player one suggests the division of the amount of money, and player two either accepts or rejects. If player two accepts, then the suggested division is the division that actually is used. If player two rejects, then they both get 0. Okay. And so this was played. This is the offer that player one makes in the ultimatum game. And this is across these 15 small scale societies. Okay. So you see there's a fair amount of variation. Society from Pittsburgh is probably going to be the society you're most familiar with, as well as a number of other smaller scale societies. Some you may be familiar with, some you may not. So Machigenga, Quechua, Hadza, the Lamalera, Shona, for example. Okay, so these are all across the world, and these are the locations of these smaller scale societies here. Okay, and so if you look at this, there's a number of striking things. Okay, so one is that there's a lot of variation. A lot of groups play closer to the Nash equilibrium, which is the Nash equilibrium essentially is for player one to offer 0 or 1 cent, some very small amount, and then player two to accept. Okay. But for a lot of societies, the modal offer is 50-50, so 50%. Okay, and so maybe that's not too surprising with, and that makes sense. There's one society here where you see a lot of offers are actually above 50%. So that's for the other player, player two, to take more than 50%. And the mean, which is given by this bar here, for this ethnic group is actually higher than 50%. So the Lamalera are kind of on the extreme here. And so it's, I think, it's interesting and informative to think about what was the environment like that the ancestors of this group was exposed to, such that this norm or this cultural trait of, you could call this prosociality, developed. Okay. And if we look at this group here, the Lamalera are a whale hunting society. They live on an island in Indonesia, and they hunt pilot whales, I believe it is, using these methods here, which is shown in this figure, using these long bamboo spears. And so it's a number of, when villagers see whales, there'll be a number of boats that are ready. They're rowboats or sailboats. They go into the ocean, and then they cooperatively or working together spear the whale. Okay, and then they have enough food for a long period of time, and then the meat, the whale meat, is distributed amongst all villagers in the society. Okay, and it's distributed based on certain customs or certain norms about how this is distributed. So it's not only the individuals that spear the whale or are involved in spearing the whale, or the families of those members, but everyone in the village benefits, right, and has access to the meat. So you can see there's a lot of cooperation. And in the society, in this environment here, if this was the only way that you could obtain subsistence, somebody who was very selfish, individualistic, not pro-social, wouldn't survive long. Okay, so this setting here in this form of obtaining subsistence was particularly conducive to generating prosociality. Okay, and so again, this illustrates how the environment affects the evolution of these traits. Okay, and so another example is closer to home, and this is motivated by a paper by Alberto Alazina, Stephanie Stancheva, and Eduardo Teso that was published in the American Economic Review in 2018. Okay, so what they do is they measure perceptions of mobility of individuals in 5 different countries. Okay, and so they ask an individual, they have a very nice, detailed way of asking people, okay, think of individuals that are at the bottom 20% in terms of income within your country. So think about then the children of those individuals. So what is the likelihood that if you're born into the bottom 20%, that you'll then as an adult be in the top 20%? Okay, this is Q1 to Q5 probability here. And so they ask this amongst participants in this survey, and the perceived probability of conditional on being in the bottom 20%, making it to the top 20% for each country is shown here. Okay, and so they plot this against the actual probability. So if they were accurate, it would be on this 45-degree line. And you can see there's something unique about the United States. Okay, they're the only country amongst these five, so it includes Italy, the UK, Sweden, and France, that are optimistic. In other words, they overestimate the probability that somebody born into a family in the bottom 20% will make it to the top 20%. Okay, perceived probability is close to 12%. The actual is closer to 8. Okay, so you might think about, well, why is the US unique? And this optimism is associated with a number of other things, which they also document. So is the American dream alive? The US is exceptional. Is effort the reason that people are poor? In other words, lack of effort the reason people are poor, and effort the reason people are rich? The US seems to be exceptional, right? They also prefer low government intervention. And they think unequal opportunity is not a problem. Okay, so for all these other things, whether the economic system is fair, how negatively or positively they view the government, the US is kind of in the middle. Okay, so there really is this over optimism about mobility. Anyone can make it as long as they work hard enough in the US. And so where does this come from? Well, if you look back in time, even just 100 years ago, 150 years ago, and there's evidence on this by Joe Ferry and Jason Long, published in the American Economic Review in 2013, the US had very high levels of mobility, much higher than you observe in other points of time or in other parts of the world. And in their paper, they compare the US to the UK and document this. Okay. Subsequent papers have shown that by the early 20th century, right, this gap had disappeared. So there's this period of time, I think, the 1800s, where mobility was extremely high in the US. And this, I think, has to do with westward expansion. If you wanted to make it, as long as you traveled far enough westward, you could within the United States. So again, I think this is a plausible example of mismatch. These views about the American dream, about whether hard work is rewarded, whether everyone can make it, about perceived mobility, they were formed 100, 150 years ago. And they were well suited to that environment, but because those things move slowly and incrementally, they aren't well suited to the current environment. Okay, and you can see that the deviation of the perception versus reality. Okay, so those are just some examples. So I think understanding history, things like institutional evolution, cultural evolution, as slow incremental changes that occur in a piecemeal fashion over time, helps us understand things like mismatch, okay, or brings that insight into view. So another example or another insight which comes from this literature, it's commonly termed more in, I guess, popular discourse as a kludge. Okay, and there's actually been work within economics. So a theoretical paper by Jeff Elley models this basically in a paper in the AJ Applied. And he defines a kludge as an improvement upon a highly complex system that solves an inefficiency, but in a piecemeal fashion. Okay, so again, we have piecemeal incremental without addressing the deep-rooted underlying problem. The kludge itself intensifies the internal inefficiency, necessitating either further kludges in the future or else eventually a complete revolution. Okay, so return back to our example here, which is just the stylized example from Richard Dawkins. So an incremental improvement in a piecemeal fashion, okay, or solves an inefficiency, but in a piecemeal fashion, means you move uphill. So things move slightly better, right? Or things become slightly better. So, but what this does is necessitates a further kludge. So you can do even better after that, or you need to move higher, you need to move higher. right? So the issue here is each time you do that, you're making it harder for yourself to get to this peak over here, or you're moving yourself further away from this peak over here. Okay. And so this is what it means that, or else eventually you need a complete revolution that somehow get to this other peak, right? So kludges make you better off in the short run, but in some sense, they're moving you further away from something that's even better in terms of a global optimum, right? They're moving you towards a local optimum, but further away from another optimum that's even better. Okay. And so some people, just loosely argue, oh, well, this is Microsoft Windows. Each patch, each fix is moving you in this direction, improving things. But really what you should do is, move to Apple, basically. And so, yeah, to a better operating system. Okay, so the quintessential example of this in biology is the bony flatfish. So this was a fish where their ancestors floated vertically in the ocean. And then at some point in the evolutionary history of this fish, they started to live on the ocean floor. Okay. And what they did is they laid on one side. Okay. And once they did this, well, the issue was one eye was looking at the sand. So over time, the eye has migrated to be on the opposite side of the fish. Okay. And so you have this fish, which is very asymmetric. It's not very optimally designed, right? So it's much, much better if the ancestors of the fish would have laid on their stomach, and then the fish would have kind of evolved in a symmetric manner. Okay. And so this is an example of a kludge, right? So the eye migrating to be on the one side of the bony flatfish improved things in the short run, but it kind of moved it further away from what would be an even better equilibrium. Okay, so one question is this concept useful for understanding human history? Okay, and this is something that I've just recently started to think about, but here's just one example. I'm sure we can think of many examples. Right, so these are basically different paths of development where the paths aren't taking you necessarily to a global optimum. So to think through this thought experiment, let's start with gender differences in reproduction. Okay, and so there are biological differences in the reproduction capacity and characteristics of men and women. So men can have many children in a 1 to 2 year period, okay, or just any period in general. However, there's uncertainty about whether any child is his. Okay, this has to do with the nature of childbirth. And so one thing that's been recognized is that, well, the optimal strategy for men might be to have quantity over quality. Okay, so the optimal strategy might be to have many kids and not invest much in each kid. Okay, women, they can have one child in a 1 or 2 year period. Okay, but there's more certainty that that child is theirs because of childbirth. Okay, so for women, this has been recognized. Optimal strategy is going to be more likely to have less children or to invest in the quality of the child they have every 1 or 2 years. Okay, and there's this issue of, well, men and women are going to have different incentives. So women may only want to have a child if the man will commit to investing in the child, right? And so this is a fundamental issue between men and women. And we can think about, well, how is this tension between the incentives of men and those of women resolved? Okay, so there's inherent tension where women would always like men to invest more in the child, and men might have a proclivity to have more children and invest less. Okay, and in part because men might have uncertainty about, is that child really theirs? Okay, so there's different solutions, and we're going to talk about kinship systems, right? So one solution is patrilineal kinship. Okay, so here the family is traced through fathers. So this is a schematic of kinship system that's patrilineal. Triangles are men, and circles are women. A color denotes a lineage. Okay, so here the children of a man and a woman belong to the lineage of the man. Okay, so you can see that they're the same colors. So these are the daughters, these are the sons, and the sons' children will belong to that same lineage. Okay, so here though, the daughter, when she gets married, will move and join the lineage of her husband. Okay, so this gray circle here is actually part of this pink lineage. Okay, it's not colored blue. Okay, so in this setting, the father is the most important male figure in the child's life. Okay, so then there's an issue, and the father is the individual who's going to invest in education, health of the child. But there's the issue about there's a potentially uncertainty about paternity. Okay, so what has evolved in many situations is a need for greater control over women, so patriarchy. So cultural customs like veiling, the burqa, female genital cutting, limited autonomy. So women needing permission, or wives needing permission of their husbands in order to do certain things. Okay. But then the question is, or the consequence of this is, well, investment in sons will be high. Okay. But what about daughters? Okay. And the issue here is that, well, daughters aren't going to be part of the father's lineage in the long run. Okay. And so what happens here is you need to develop another custom, which is the bride price, which incentivizes investments in daughters. Okay. So a bride price is a payment that's made to, in this case, will be the daughter's family, right, at the time of marriage, from the husband or the husband's family. Okay. So it's really a gift of exchange for the family of the daughter, investing in the daughter, educating her, raising her, keeping her in good health, even though they knew that as an adult she would join another lineage. Okay, so it's this kind of reciprocal gift giving. And so that develops, and that helps to incentivize investments in daughters, not only sons, which are going to be part of the lineage. Okay, so these things develop along this path. Okay, so that basically solves this problem about having men have enough paternity certainty so that they invest in the children in their lineage. Okay, or in the case of daughters, a child who's going to join another lineage. So there's another solution, which is matrilineal kinship. So here, family is traced through mothers. The uncle is the most important male figure in the child's life. The uncle is the one that will probably invest. Okay, so here we can see this. You can see the lineage is indicated by red. You can see that the mother is in the lineage. Her children are actually in her lineage. They're not in the father's lineage. Okay, so it's an interesting thing where within the nuclear family, there's a division, and the father aren't of the same lineage as the children. Okay. And so here's a mother, here's daughters, this is a brother, and then here's the children, right, of the sister of this brother here. Okay. If you think about for these children, who's the most important male figure in their life, it's not this triangle here, which is their father, right? Because the father belongs to a different lineage. It's going to actually be their uncle, which is this individual here. And it's the uncle that's going to provide the resources for the children by and large. Okay, so how does this solve the problem of paternity certainty? Well, there might be a lot of uncertainty about whether the father is biologically related to the children, but there's less certainty, almost no uncertainty, that the uncle is unrelated to the children. Okay, so it's known that the uncle, right, and the mother both came from the what's commonly called this, or commonly described as the stomach of the mother, right? And then they come from the stomach of their mother, right? So we know that the brother and sister are biologically related because they have the same mother, and the children are biologically related to the mother. So with certainty, you know that the uncle is biologically related to the children. Okay, and so in this way, investment by the men, right, in children is going to be high, but it's investment of uncles in their nieces and nephews. So this father here would invest money in his nieces and nephews. Okay, so I think it's worth, that's two paths that I described, or two solutions, right? And it's worth thinking about, well, which peak is higher? So there's recent evidence by Sarah Lowe's in a working paper looking within the Democratic Republic of Congo, documenting that actually under matrilineal kinship, children seem to be better off, they're more educated, they're healthier, women are happier, and there's less domestic violence. Okay, so it seems like solution 2, matrilineal kinship, is better than solution 1. So we can think of that as being a peak up here, whereas patrilineal kinship with patriarchy and control of women by men is this suboptimal peak. Okay, so the interesting thing is, if we look globally, that solution 1, right, patrilineal kinship is much, much more common than solution 2. Okay, maybe 90% of societies, something like this, is patrilineal relative to matrilineal. Okay, and if we moved from 1 to 2, so imagine we're here, we're kind of optimized with patrilineal kinship, patriarchy, bride price, and we wanted to move to matrilineal kinship, we'd have to one by one undo each of these customs. And each time we undid them, we'd be moving downhill and we'd be making the society worse off. Okay, so you need to do that before you can then move uphill to matrilineal kinship. Okay, so I think this is one potential insight about kludges, right, or that come from thinking of kludges, which is, you know, one description of path dependence, essentially. There's other examples. I won't go through details, but I think it's worth thinking about. And if anyone's interested, they can read the papers I have here. A great paper by Ben Enke, Jonathan Schultz, and co-authors in Science recently. Paper with myself, Jacob Moscona, and James Robinson, just thinking about kinship ties. And there's different paths which have developed of kinship ties leading to state institutions. So one is the experience of Western Europe, and that's described in the Jonathan Schultz et al. Paper. But then there's also another experience where states are based on kinship ties. An example of these are segmentary states, which we talk about in our paper, right? And Ben Enke has a nice paper where he kind of documents the full variation in the strength of kinship ties, and as well, their importance for economic development and state development. Okay, so I'll leave this as further reading for anyone who's interested in thinking about this more. Okay. So those are two examples, and I think I've tried to provide some sense about why history is important, and if we particularly why it's informative to think about paths of development, paths of history, especially once we understand that history is incremental, slow-moving, piecemeal change, right? And we can use that framework to start to think about things like cultural evolution or change in cultural traits, change in institutions, and economic development. Okay, so that's interesting and potentially informative if we want to understand the world of the past. Okay, but one might think that's just an academic question. We really don't need to understand the way the world is, how it got to be the way it is today, if what we want to do is just move forward and improve the world. Okay, so it might be interesting, it might be fun, but do we really need to do that? Okay, so in other words, you know, can't we just, you know, randomize, figure out what policies work best, RCT our way out of poverty, and that doesn't require knowing about the past or understanding the mechanisms, the causal dynamics that I just talked about. So I would argue that in this case, understanding history is still essential. The best way to move forward depends critically, I would say, on the process that got us to where we are today. So you need to understand how we got to where we are, the evolutionary dynamics, the paths that got us to where we are, in order to understand what we do next. Okay. And so let me give you just a few examples of this. I think we need to understand this much more, but I think a few examples can prove this point. So this is a recent paper by Sarah Lowe's and Eduardo Montero, two former students, which is forthcoming in the American Economic Review. And they wanted to understand this occurrence or phenomenon that you observe in many parts of the world, including many parts of Africa, that individuals tend to be suspicious and even refuse medical treatment or Western medical interventions. This was observed during Ebola. There are many cases during vaccination campaigns, for example. And this is particularly frustrating to many because we've had all these medical breakthroughs. We mobilize resources and we bring these medical improvements to different parts of the developing world, and then kind of these efforts fail at the last step because people are too distrustful to get their kids vaccinated for polio, for example. Okay, so they wanted to understand, well, what are the roots of this? Is it that people are acting completely irrationally, or is there an explanation? Okay, and as we'll see, the way I would characterize this is an example of mismatch, right? People aren't acting irrationally. There are concrete, logical reasons why there is this distrust. It does have these consequences. And if we understand the situation, we're going to understand how to move forward a lot better. Okay, and so what they look at is French colonial medical campaigns. These are campaigns where during the French colonial period, attempts were made to eradicate sleeping sickness. So this is also called trypanosomiasis. Villagers were required, often at gunpoint, to submit to physical exams. Okay, so they're trying to be efficient. So they used coercion or worked with village chiefs to have people undertake these exams. So the test was spinal tap, and in many cases they treated everyone, right? Even whether or not they tested for sleeping sickness or not. And early treatment was an arsenic-based drug called Atoxyl. Okay, turns out ex post that it caused blindness in 20% of those that were treated. So this was one downside of this. So you can see in this environment that people may have generated a fear or mistrust of Western medicine. Okay, so they document this or try and measure this using archival sources. They look at French Equatorial Africa, and they find that in French Equatorial Africa, that places that had been visited during the colonial period by more medical campaigns, right, have lower trust in Western medicine today, lower vaccination rates, more likely to refuse blood tests. And if you look at aid projects related to health projects or medical interventions, they're less successful in those areas that have had more medical campaigns in the past and have lower trust in Western medicine. Okay, so their paper was the first to document this. It really wasn't known. A number of these projects had been undertaken with varying degrees of success without an understanding of these underlying differences in trust of medicine, which have these historical evolutionary roots. Okay, so once you know this, you can then think about, oh, how do we design or put effort into interventions in different places to help overcome this issue, right? To help inform people, to help build trust. And in certain places, that extra effort is going to be required, and others it might be less required. Okay. So another example is of another intervention, which is about education. So in 1973, the Indonesian government launched a program that built 62,000 schools. So this is very famous. Program that was studied by Esther Duflo many years ago in a well-known AER paper. And it was the biggest school construction project ever undertaken. Was it a success? So Esther Duflo's paper shows that it did lead to a greater education of boys. But what about for girls? If you look at girls, what you find is it had zero effect on average. Okay, so that in Indonesia, schools are built, but girls aren't being sent to school. Girls' education does not increase. Okay, but it turns out that this masks significant heterogeneity. So for some ethnic groups, the effect is positive and large. For others, the effect is 0. Okay, and then we dug deeper and found that in Zambia, you find the same thing. Okay, so they had a large school construction program in the 90s and early 2000s. And so what explains the difference? What's different about those groups that sent their daughters to school after schools are built and those that didn't? Well, it's the bride price, which we talked about, right? Which is a payment from the groom or the groom's family to the bride's family at marriage. We talked about the historical roots of that, the logic behind it, or the evolutionary logic behind it, okay? And so places that have a tradition of bride price, when schools are built, then families tended to send their daughters to school. In other words, amongst those ethnic groups, school construction worked great. Amongst other ethnic groups, it didn't work at all, okay? And so here's variation within Indonesia and Zambia. A darker color indicates a greater prevalence of bride price amongst individuals living in those districts or provinces. Okay, and so why is that? So if you dig into the data, and these are from surveys, you ask individuals, well, what's the #1 determinant of the value of the bride price? So essentially how much money is paid to the parents of the daughter at the time of marriage. The most common answer, right, is education. So 37% of respondents listed that as the first, 15% of the second, and 10% as the third. Okay, and then if you just look at the data, what you find is education has a large, quantitatively large effect on the value of the bride price. Okay, so when if a daughter graduates from primary school, the bride price doubles. Then secondary school, the bride price doubles again. And the bride price in general tends to be large, equal to, on average, a year's worth of income. Okay, so this is an economic incentive that parents are aware of, that if I send my daughter to school, when she gets married, the bride price we're going to receive is higher, right? So they were parents from ethnic groups that had the bride price were more quick or more willing to send their daughters to school in response to school construction, whereas parents from ethnic groups that did not have the bride price didn't have that additional incentive. Okay, so again, here's an example in Indonesia and Zambia. Understanding the differences between those two ethnic groups is going to be informative and helpful when understanding the efficacy of these school construction programs. And again, much like the example with medicine from the Loza Montero paper, understanding for which groups the intervention is going to be more or less successful is helpful in understanding where you need to tailor the intervention or add more to the intervention to improve its efficacy. Okay. So coming back to the big question, why bother with history? So as I mentioned, it is true that history is useful for economic development, right? You have more data, more natural experiments, more instruments, great. But I really want to argue that history is important for reasons beyond this. And I'd argue that it's actually necessary for us to have a complete understanding of economic growth and development. I'd say even unbiased understanding. Okay, so that is everything. So thank you very much. I hope that that you found some of these thoughts informative. I think if you would like to read more in more detail, I just tried to provide a sampling here. There's a number of papers where where these thoughts are drawn from and have been developed in further detail, and I leave these here for the interested audience member and someone who'd like to read more. So otherwise, thank you very much. It was my pleasure to talk for these minutes about some of my recent research. Thank you very much.